The spring of 1968 brought new life to the small university town, nestled in the green hills of Vermont. Trees that had stood bare against winter skies now burst with fresh leaves, and colorful flowers dotted the campus lawns. It was on one of these perfect spring days that Harold Mason first noticed her. Harold was walking back from his engineering class, a stack of textbooks balanced in his arms, when he spotted a young woman sitting alone by the edge of the campus lake. She was perched on a weathered wooden bench, a sketch pad on her lap, completely absorbed in whatever she was drawing. The late afternoon sun caught in her chestnut hair, creating a halo effect that made Harold stop in his tracks. For several minutes, he stood watching her from a distance, admiring the focused way she moved her pencil across the page, how she would occasionally look up to study the water before returning to her work. Harold wasn't usually one to approach strangers. At 23, he had always been the serious type, methodical, thoughtful, and a bit shy. His roommates often teased him about spending Saturday nights with his nose in a book instead of at campus parties. But something about this woman by the lake pulled at him. Taking a deep breath, Harold adjusted his glasses, smoothed down his button-up shirt, and walked toward her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice coming out more nervously than he'd intended. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I was wondering what you're drawing." The woman looked up, startled at first, then smiled. Her eyes were a warm hazel that crinkled at the corners when she grinned. "The way the light hits the water," she replied, turning her sketch pad so he could see. "See how it creates those ripple patterns? I've been trying to capture that for an hour now." Harold looked at her drawing, a beautiful rendering of the lake with remarkable detail in the way the trees reflected on the water's surface. "That's incredible," he said, genuinely impressed. "You're very talented." "Thank you," she said, closing her sketchbook. "I'm Eleanor, by the way. Eleanor Bennett." "Harold Mason," he replied, awkwardly shifting his books to offer his hand, which she shook with a firm grip. "Are you an art major?" Eleanor nodded. "Just started this semester." "And you?" "Engineering. I'm in my final year." A brief silence fell between them, the kind that should have been awkward but somehow wasn't. Harold noticed a small paint stain on the sleeve of her sweater, a splash of blue that matched the lake behind her. "Would you maybe want to get coffee sometime?" The words tumbled out before Harold could overthink them. "The campus cafe makes a decent cup, or so I've heard." Eleanor looked at him thoughtfully, as if making up her mind about something important. Then her face broke into a smile that Harold would remember for the rest of his life. "How about now?" she suggested. "I could use a break." That coffee stretched into dinner at a small Italian restaurant just off campus. Harold found himself talking more than he usually did, telling Eleanor about growing up in a small town in Massachusetts, about his passion for classical music that his football coach father never quite understood, about his dreams of teaching someday. Eleanor was an even better listener than she was an artist, asking just the right questions that made Harold feel truly heard for perhaps the first time in his life. In turn, she told him about growing up in upstate New York, about losing her mother at a young age, and how art had become her way of making sense of the world. She spoke with her hands as much as her words, gesturing expressively in a way that fascinated Harold. "I believe art and science are just different languages describing the same universe," she said, twirling spaghetti around her fork. "Your equations and my paintings, they're both trying to capture what's real." By the time they parted ways that night, exchanging phone numbers scribbled on napkins, Harold knew something significant had shifted in his carefully ordered life. Their second date was at the University Symphony, where Harold's favorite Mozart piece was being performed. He'd been nervous about inviting Eleanor, worried that classical music might bore her. Instead, he found her completely absorbed in the music, her eyes closed during the most moving passages. When he walked her back to her dormitory afterward, she linked her arm through his, leaning slightly against him in the cool evening air. "I've never heard anything so beautiful," she whispered. "It's like the music was painting pictures in my mind." Their third date was at a small art gallery downtown where one of Eleanor's professors had a showing. Harold, who had never given much thought to modern art, found himself captivated by the way Eleanor explained each piece, helping him see the emotion and thought behind splashes of color and unusual shapes. Spring turned to summer, and summer to fall. They spent every free moment together, studying in the library, though Harold found it increasingly difficult to focus with Eleanor beside him. picnicking by the lake where they'd first met, exploring the small shops and cafes in town. Eleanor introduced Harold to her artistic friends, a colorful group who initially intimidated him but soon made him feel welcome. In turn, Harold brought Eleanor to engineering department gatherings where his professors noted how the usually reserved student had come out of his shell. By Christmas, Harold knew. He saved up from his part-time job at the campus bookstore and bought a small diamond ring that cost him nearly a full semester's savings. He proposed on New Year's Eve as they watched fireworks from the roof of his apartment building, snowflakes gently falling around them. Eleanor Bennett, I know this might seem fast, but when something is right, you just know it. Will you marry me? Eleanor's eyes widened, a flash of something, doubt, fear, crossing her face so quickly Harold almost missed it. Then she threw her arms around him, whispering, yes, yes, of course yes, against his neck as the sky exploded with color above them. They married the following June in a small ceremony at the campus chapel. Eleanor wore a dress she designed herself, simple, elegant, with tiny blue flowers embroidered along the hem that matched the lake in her paintings. Harold's parents came, his father awkwardly patting him on the back and saying, "She's a keeper, son," which from him was high praise indeed. Eleanor had no family present, explaining that her father was too ill to travel, but her art professor gave her away, beaming with pride. After a brief honeymoon camping in the White Mountains, all they could afford, they moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment near the university. Harold had been offered a teaching position in the engineering department, unusual for someone so young, but his professors had recognized his exceptional talent. Eleanor set up a small studio in the corner of their living room, taking commissions for portraits and selling her landscapes at local craft fairs. Their first year of marriage was both wonderful and challenging. They learned each other's habits, how Harold needed everything in its place while Eleanor created in cheerful chaos, how she stayed up late while he rose with the sun, how they both needed to compromise more than they'd expected. Money was tight, but they found joy in simple pleasures, Sunday morning pancakes, walks in the park, second-hand books they read aloud to each other in bed. Friends and family often commented on what an unusual but perfect match they made, Harold with his logical mind and quiet manner, Eleanor with her artistic spirit and outgoing nature. They balanced each other, each filling in what the other lacked. "How did you know she was the one?" one of Harold's colleagues asked him at a faculty dinner, watching Eleanor across the room as she charmed the department head with a funny story. Harold thought about it for a moment. "She sees the world in color," he finally said. "And since meeting her, so do I." What Harold didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Eleanor held a secret close to her heart. Sometimes, late at night when he was asleep, she would look at his peaceful face and feel both overwhelming love and a gnawing guilt. On those nights, she would slip out of bed and paint until dawn, creating beautiful landscapes that captured places she'd never actually been. Harold assumed these came from her imagination, unaware that they were memories of a life he knew nothing about. But those were concerns for another time, in a future neither of them could yet see. In that first year together, they were simply Harold and Eleanor Mason, a young couple starting their life together, creating a foundation of love that would support them through 55 years of joy, sorrow, and eventually an astonishing truth that would change everything they thought they knew about their life together. The years seemed to fly by for Harold and Eleanor. By 1975, Harold had established himself as one of the most respected professors in the engineering department. Students flocked to his classes, drawn by his clear explanations and genuine interest in their progress. Eleanor had built a small but loyal following for her artwork, selling paintings at local galleries and teaching evening art classes at the community center. Their tiny apartment, once charming, had begun to feel cramped. Eleanor's art supplies spilled from their designated corner into every available space. Harold's books formed precarious towers beside their bed. They started dreaming of a place with room to breathe, somewhere they could truly call their own. "I saw a house today," Eleanor mentioned one evening as they washed dishes side by side. "It's on Oak Street, the one with the big elm tree out front." Harold paused, soapy plate in hand. "The Victorian with the peeling paint? The one that's been empty for years?" Eleanor nodded, eyes bright with excitement. "It needs work, a lot of work, but Harold, if you could see past all that, it's perfect. There's this sunroom that faces east. Can you imagine what a studio that would make?" The following weekend, they toured the house with a real estate agent who warned them repeatedly about the extensive repairs needed. The roof leaked in 3 places. The plumbing was outdated. The electrical wiring needed to be completely redone. "It's a money pit," the agent said bluntly. "Unless you're handy with tools or rich enough to hire contractors, I'd recommend something more. Move-in ready." But Harold and Eleanor saw something else. They saw high ceilings and hardwood floors beneath worn carpets. They saw a grand staircase with intricate woodwork. They saw large windows that flooded rooms with natural light. And yes, they saw that sunroom, with windows on 3 sides offering views of what had once been a garden. "We'll take it," Harold said, surprising himself with his decisiveness. The bank approved their mortgage application by the narrowest of margins. With Harold's steady income and promising career trajectory, plus the small inheritance he'd received when his grandmother passed, they just qualified. They moved in on a rainy Saturday in April, their few possessions looking lost in the large, empty rooms. That first night, they sat on their mattress on the floor of what would be their bedroom, eating pizza straight from the box and drinking cheap champagne from coffee mugs. "To our home," Harold toasted, clinking his mug against Eleanor's. "To possibilities," she added, looking around at the peeling wallpaper and water-stained ceiling with undimmed enthusiasm. The renovations consumed the next 5 years of weekends and evenings. Harold discovered an unexpected talent for carpentry, learning from books and the occasional advice of hardware store employees. Eleanor revealed herself to be fearless with a sledgehammer, and particular about paint colors down to the tiniest shade difference. They argued over wallpaper patterns and light fixtures. They compromised on bathroom tiles and kitchen cabinets. "Who needs television when you have home renovation?" joked their neighbor Tom, who often stopped by with homemade cookies and practical advice about gardening. Tom and his wife Betty quickly became their closest friends, the 4 of them sharing meals and holidays and the occasional vacation. By 1980, the house had transformed. The sunroom was now Eleanor's studio, with custom-built shelves for her supplies and a skylight Harold had installed as a birthday surprise. The kitchen featured warm yellow walls and a breakfast nook where they lingered over coffee on weekend mornings. The living room housed Harold's growing collection of classical records and the comfortable sofa where they read together on winter evenings. It was around this time that the subject of children first arose seriously. They'd always vaguely planned on having a family someday, but that someday had never seemed to arrive. "My sister keeps asking when we're going to give her nieces or nephews," Harold mentioned one night as they prepared dinner. Eleanor's knife paused over the carrot she was chopping. "And what do you tell her?" "That we're busy. That we're still fixing up the house." Harold hesitated. "But honestly, Elle, I've been thinking about it more lately. Wouldn't it be nice to have a little one running around? Someone with your artistic eye or maybe my knack for numbers?" Eleanor set down her knife and turned to face him. "Harold, there's something I should have told you before we got married." Her voice was steady but quiet. "When I was 14, I got very sick. The doctor said afterward that I wouldn't be able to have children." Harold put down the spoon he'd been using to stir the pasta sauce and crossed the kitchen to take her in his arms. "Why didn't you tell me?" She pressed her face against his shoulder. "I was afraid it would change things between us, that you might not want to marry me." "Nothing could have changed how I felt about you," Harold said, kissing the top of her head. "Nothing ever will." They spoke that night about other options, adoption, fostering, but in the end they decided their family would be just the 2 of them. Instead of children, they filled their home and lives with other loves. Books that lined custom-built shelves in nearly every room. Music that played from the stereo Harold upgraded every few years. And a succession of rescue dogs that brought muddy paws and unconditional love into their lives. The first was Rusty, a copper-colored mutt with one ear that flopped over and eyes that seemed to understand every word they said. He came to them from the local shelter, where Eleanor volunteered on Saturdays. Then came Daisy, found shivering under their porch during a thunderstorm. After Daisy was Old Scout, already gray-muzzled when they adopted him, who moved slowly but loved deeply during his few years with them. In the world beyond their home, things were changing too. Harold was named department chair in 1983, the youngest person ever to hold the position. His research on structural engineering was published in prestigious journals, and universities with bigger names occasionally tried to lure him away with impressive offers. We could move to Boston, he told Eleanor after one such offer. The salary would be almost double. Eleanor looked around at the home they'd built together, at the garden now thriving under their care, at the community they'd become part of. Is that what you want? Harold considered it honestly, then shook his head. No, this is home. Eleanor's art career blossomed as well. Her landscapes, with their distinctive style that somehow captured not just the look but the feeling of a place, began to sell regularly at galleries in Burlington and even Boston. A small write-up in a regional art magazine led to more commissions than she could accept. Mrs. Mason, your work reminds me of Edward Hopper, but with more heart, said a gallery owner who drove up from New York to meet her. There's a melancholy there, but also a deep appreciation for the beauty in ordinary things. Eleanor accepted the compliment with a smile, though later she told Harold, I'm not trying to be like anyone else. I'm just painting what I see. Every summer they traveled. It started as a simple road trip to Maine in 1976, with a tent in the trunk and no real itinerary. The freedom of it, the joy of discovering small towns and hidden beaches, of making decisions day by day, captivated them both. Travel became their annual tradition, growing more ambitious as their financial situation improved. They drove the coast of California in 1979, camping under redwoods and walking hand in hand along Pacific beaches. They visited the Grand Canyon in 1982, Harold taking photographs while Eleanor sketched, both of them awed into silence by the vastness before them. They flew to England in 1985, renting a small car and meandering through the countryside, staying at bed and breakfast where Eleanor charmed the owners and Harold studied maps for the next day's adventure. Always, they created parallel records of their journeys, Harold with his camera, capturing precise moments, Eleanor laughing by a waterfall, a fox crossing their path at dawn, the perfect symmetry of a cathedral ceiling, Eleanor with her sketchbooks recording impressions, the feeling of mist on her face, the way light filtered through leaves, the sense of history in ancient stones. These trips became the framework of their years, the stories they told at dinner parties, the memories they revisited on winter evenings. Between these adventures, they built a life rich in small pleasures. The vegetable garden Harold tended with scientific precision, the Christmas parties they hosted for colleagues and students, the Sunday afternoon concerts in the park where they always brought a picnic and sat on their red plaid blanket. Looking back later, Harold would recognize these as golden years, though they didn't seem extraordinary while they were living them. They were simply building their life together, one day at a time, creating something beautiful and solid and true, or so he believed. The calendar pages turned faster as Harold and Eleanor moved through their 50s and 60s. The new millennium arrived with much less chaos than predicted, though Harold had prepared anyway, stocking extra water and canned goods that they ended up donating to the local food bank. Eleanor had teased him gently about his caution, but there was affection in her teasing. After more than 30 years together, they had settled into the comfortable rhythms of a long marriage. Harold's hair had thinned and whitened, while Eleanor's chestnut waves were now streaked with silver, which she refused to color despite her friend's suggestions. I've earned every one of these, she would say, running her fingers through her hair. Why would I hide them? Retirement came for Harold at 68, marked by a grand party organized by his department. Former students flew in from across the country to celebrate the professor who had shaped their careers and, in many cases, their lives. The university president presented him with a Distinguished Service Medal, and the engineering building's East Wing was renamed in his honor. I don't know what to do with myself now, Harold admitted to Eleanor the morning after his retirement party. He stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, looking somewhat lost. You'll figure it out, Eleanor said, squeezing his shoulder as she passed. You always do. It took 6 months, but Harold found his second calling in the most unexpected place, their backyard. What began as puttering around to fill time transformed into a passion for gardening that rivaled his love for engineering. He approached it with the same methodical precision, reading botanical texts, testing soil pH, and drafting garden plans with the exactness he once applied to structural formulas. Within 2 years, their backyard had transformed into an English-style garden that drew admiring visitors from throughout the neighborhood. There were winding paths of crushed stone, a small pond with water lilies and carefully planned flower beds that ensured something was always in bloom from early spring through late fall. Harold installed benches at strategic points where the view was particularly lovely, and Eleanor often brought her easel outside to capture the changing light on his botanical creations. "You've created something magical," Eleanor told him one evening as they sat on their favorite bench, watching fireflies rise from the lavender border. "It's like living inside a painting." Harold smiled, taking her hand in his. "I finally understand why you love art so much. Creating something beautiful. There's nothing quite like it." Eleanor's career had evolved too. Though she still painted regularly, she now spent more time teaching workshops at the local arts center and mentoring younger artists. Her work had gained significant recognition over the years, with several pieces in permanent collections at regional museums and a retrospective exhibition at the University Gallery that had drawn impressive crowds. As they entered their 70s, their Victorian home, now fully restored and lovingly maintained, became a natural gathering place. Sunday dinners regularly featured a mix of former students, artist friends, neighbors, and the occasional stray newcomer to town who'd somehow found their way into Harold and Eleanor's orbit. "You two should open a restaurant," joked Phil, a former student of Harold's who now taught at the university himself. "Nobody makes pot roast like Eleanor. And nobody pours a drink like Harold," added Lisa, a local potter who had been Eleanor's friend for decades. "Secrets in the wrist action," she teased, mimicking his precise pouring technique. These gatherings filled the house with laughter and conversation that often stretched late into the evening. Harold and Eleanor would clean up afterward in comfortable silence, both privately marveling at the rich tapestry of relationships they had woven over their decades together. Retirement brought new opportunities for giving back to the community that had been their home for so long. Eleanor volunteered at the children's wing of the hospital, helping young patients express themselves through art during long stays. Harold spent Tuesday and Thursday mornings at the town library, repairing old books and helping organize the annual used book sale. Together, they established a small scholarship fund for promising students in art and engineering, particularly those who might otherwise struggle to afford college. Each year they hosted a dinner for the recipients, taking genuine interest in their goals and challenges. "We never had children of our own," Harold explained to a curious neighbor. "This is our way of passing something on." Life wasn't without its shadows. They lost old friends to illness and age. Their beloved dog Chester, a gentle black lab who had been with them for 14 years, died peacefully one winter morning, his head resting on Harold's lap. Eleanor's arthritis made painting painful sometimes, though she refused to stop. "The day I stop creating is the day I stop breathing," she declared, adapting her style to accommodate her stiffening hands. And there were the odd moments that Harold couldn't quite explain. For as long as he could remember, Eleanor had always grown distant around her birthday in late April. Early in their marriage, he had tried to plan special celebrations only to find her withdrawn and quiet, preferring to spend the day alone in her studio. Over time, he learned to give her space on that day, attributing her mood to sensitivity about aging or perhaps memories of her childhood. There were other mysteries, too. Occasionally, Eleanor would receive phone calls that she took in private, speaking in hushed tones that fell silent when Harold entered the room. When he asked, she would smile and say it was just gallery business or an old friend catching up. Harold never pressed the issue. Their marriage was built on trust, and he respected her right to privacy. Once a year, usually in the fall, Eleanor would take a weekend trip alone, explaining that she needed time to recharge her creative batteries. She would return with new sketches and a peaceful expression, and Harold was happy that she had found what she needed. As they approached their 50th wedding anniversary, Harold secretly planned a surprise. Working with a local jeweler, he designed a pendant featuring a miniature reproduction of the lake where they had first met, crafted in silver and blue enamel. The piece took months to complete, but Harold knew it would be worth the wait. The celebration was small but meaningful. Dinner at their favorite restaurant with their closest friends, followed by a chamber music concert at the university. When Harold presented Eleanor with the pendant, she grew uncharacteristically quiet, tears filling her eyes. "It's where our story began," Harold said softly, helping her fasten the chain around her neck. Eleanor touched the pendant with trembling fingers. "It's perfect," she whispered, though something in her expression suggested a deeper emotion than simple gratitude. Later that night, Harold found her in her studio staring at old sketchbooks with a faraway look in her eyes. "Happy memories?" he asked from the doorway. She closed the book quickly. "The happiest," she said, smiling at him with such love that any momentary concern faded from his mind. The years continued their gentle march. Harold and Eleanor adjusted to the limitations of aging bodies while maintaining active minds. They traveled less but read more. Their garden grew slightly wilder as Harold couldn't maintain it with the same precision, but visitors still remarked on its beauty. Eleanor's paintings became looser, more abstract, but critics noted they carried even more emotional depth. Their 75th birthdays came and went. Then their 80th. They celebrated their 55th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at home, raising their glasses to a life well lived together. "To the next 55, Harold toasted, only half joking. Eleanor smiled, clinking her glass against his. "To every single day we get," she replied, her eyes holding his with an intensity that struck him as almost urgent, as if she was trying to memorize his face. Neither of them could have known then how few days remained, or how the foundation of their shared life was about to be shaken by a truth that had remained buried for over 5 decades. The winter following their 55th anniversary was unusually harsh. Snow piled in drifts against the Victorian's north side, and ice formed delicate patterns on the inside of the original window panes that Harold had insisted on preserving during their renovations. Eleanor worried about Harold shoveling the walkway, but he waved away her concerns. "I'm 83, not dead," he joked one morning, wrapping a scarf around his neck before heading outside. But when he came back in, his face was pale and he was breathing harder than the task should have warranted. Eleanor made him sit down while she prepared hot tea, watching him with worried eyes over the rim of her mug. "Maybe we should look into a snow removal service next year," she suggested gently. Harold frowned. "Waste of money. I'm perfectly capable." But he wasn't, not really, and they both knew it. Over the past few months, Harold had been slowing down in ways that couldn't be explained by normal aging. He tired more easily. His appetite had diminished. Sometimes he winced when he stood up or sat down, though he tried to hide it. Eleanor noticed everything. She'd always been attentive, but lately her eyes followed him with an intensity that Harold found both touching and slightly irritating. "You're hovering," he told her one evening when she appeared at his side with an extra blanket he hadn't asked. "For you were shivering," she replied simply, tucking it around his legs. He was about to deny it when he realized she was right. Despite the furnace working overtime and the fire crackling in the hearth, he couldn't seem to get warm lately. "I'll make an appointment with Dr. Chen," he promised, more to ease the worry in Eleanor's eyes than because he thought anything was seriously wrong. Probably just a stubborn winter cold. Or perhaps he needed his thyroid checked. His mother had had problems with hers in her later years. The appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Eleanor insisted on coming along, though Harold protested that he didn't need a babysitter. "Partners," she corrected him. "We're partners, and partners show up." Dr. Chen had been their physician for nearly 20 years, a thoughtful woman with a calm demeanor who had seen them through various age-related complaints and minor health scares. She listened carefully as Harold described his symptoms, the fatigue, the decreased appetite, the occasional pain in his abdomen that he'd been dismissing as indigestion. "Let's run some tests," she said, her expression giving nothing away. "Blood work first, and I'd like to schedule an ultrasound of your abdomen." "Is that really necessary?" Harold asked. "Couldn't it just be a virus or something?" Dr. Chen's gaze was steady. "It could be many things. The test will help us narrow it down." The next 2 weeks became a blur of medical appointments. Blood tests led to the ultrasound, which led to more specialized scans, each with longer names and more complicated machines. Harold approached it all with the intellectual curiosity of a former academic, asking technical questions about how the equipment worked to distract himself from why it was being used on him. Eleanor was quieter, absorbing the medical terminology with a focused attention that reminded Harold of how she looked when mixing just the right shade of paint. She took notes in a small leather-bound journal, writing down questions to ask at the next appointment and keeping track of every medication and instruction. The day they received the diagnosis was unusually bright for February, sunshine streaming through the windows of Dr. Chen's office in a way that seemed cruelly at odds with the conversation taking place inside. The imaging studies and biopsy confirm pancreatic cancer, Dr. Chen said, her voice gentle but direct. Unfortunately, it appears to have metastasized to the liver and lymph nodes. Harold felt Eleanor's hand tighten around his. His own mind was curiously blank, as if the words were in a language he didn't quite understand. "What's the treatment plan?" Eleanor asked, her voice steadier than Harold would have expected. "Surgery? Chemotherapy?" Dr. Chen's expression softened with compassion. Given the advanced stage and Harold's age, aggressive treatment would likely cause more suffering than benefit. "We can certainly pursue palliative chemotherapy if that's your wish, but I want to be honest about the prognosis." "How long?" Harold found his voice at last. "Without treatment, weeks to a month. With palliative measures, perhaps 2 to 3 months, but with significantly reduced quality of life." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Harold was aware of Eleanor's breathing beside him. A little too controlled, a little too measured, as if she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "I'd like to go home and think about options," Harold said finally. "Is that all right?" "Of course," Dr. Chen nodded. "Take the time you need. I'll have my nurse give you some information about palliative care services and hospice options, just so you have it." The drive home was quiet. Eleanor's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Harold had given up driving the previous year when his reflexes had slowed too much for safety. He looked out the window at the town passing by, seeing it with new eyes. The bakery where they bought sourdough bread on Saturdays, the hardware store where he'd spent countless hours selecting just the right tools for their home renovations, the park where they walked their dogs over the years, all so ordinary, so precious. "I don't want the chemo," he said as they pulled into their driveway. "I want whatever time I have left to be at home with you." "No hospitals, no machines." Eleanor turned off the engine but didn't move to get out of the car. "Are you sure?" "Without even trying, I'm sure." Harold reached over and covered her hand with his. "I'm an engineer, remember? I understand the numbers, and I understand what matters most." That evening, they sat together on the sofa, a fire burning in the hearth. Their current dog, a gentle golden retriever mix named Sunny, sleeping at their feet. They didn't speak much, but Harold felt a lifetime of conversation flowing between them without words. The next day, Eleanor went into action mode. She contacted a hospice service recommended by Dr. Chen, interviewed nurses until she found one she felt comfortable with, and rearranged the downstairs study into a bedroom so Harold wouldn't have to navigate the stairs. "You don't have to do all this yourself," Harold protested weakly when he found her struggling to move his favorite armchair into the makeshift bedroom. "We could hire people." "I need to do this," she replied, and something in her tone made him step back and let her continue. Friends and former colleagues began stopping by once word got out. Harold was touched by their visits but found himself tiring quickly. Eleanor became a gentle gatekeeper, limiting visitors to short stays and making sure Harold had plenty of rest between them. "You always did take care of me better than I deserved," he told her one afternoon after she'd shooed away a well-meaning but overly talkative neighbor. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. "Nonsense. You deserve every good thing this world has to offer." As February turned to March, Harold's condition deteriorated more rapidly than even Dr. Chen had predicted. The pain increased despite medication, and his once sturdy frame seemed to shrink before Eleanor's eyes. The hospice nurse, a kind woman named Ruth, visited daily, adjusting medications and offering practical advice along with compassion. Harold's mind remained sharp even as his body failed him. He spent hours looking through old photo albums with Eleanor, reminiscing about their travels and the life they'd built. He dictated letters to former students who couldn't visit in person. He had long conversations with their closest friends, finding a strange freedom in the honesty that impending death permitted. "No regrets," he told his oldest friend Tom, who had driven up from Boston for the weekend. "Well, maybe I wish I'd planted more daffodils last fall. They're Eleanor's favorites, you know." Tom promised to return in April and plant 100 bulbs in the garden, a promise they both knew was meant more for Eleanor than for Harold. Through it all, Eleanor was a constant presence, anticipating Harold's needs often before he recognized them himself. She read to him when his eyes grew too tired to focus on the page. She helped him to the sunroom on good days, so he could look out at the garden where the first signs of spring were appearing. She played his favorite classical records and sat beside him, her hand in his as the music filled the room. But Harold noticed changes in Eleanor too. She was making phone calls from the kitchen in hushed tones, ending them abruptly when he came within earshot. She spent hours in her studio with the door closed, though he rarely heard the sounds of painting, and sometimes he would catch her looking at him with such intense longing and regret that it made his heart ache in a way that had nothing to do with his illness. "Is there something you want to talk about?" he asked her one evening as she helped him into bed. Eleanor paused, her hand still holding his arm. "Why do you ask? You seem, I don't know, like something's weighing on you. Something beyond the obvious." He gestured weakly at his failing body. She managed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just worried about you. That's all." Harold didn't believe her, but he lacked the energy to press further. Whatever it was, he trusted that Eleanor would tell him when she was ready. 3 days before the end, though neither of them knew the exact timeline then, Harold woke from a nap to find Eleanor sitting beside his bed, holding a worn leather journal he'd never seen before. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying while he slept. "Harold," she said softly, reaching for his hand, "there's something I need to tell you." Harold looked at the worn leather journal in Eleanor's hands, then at her face. In 55 years of marriage, he had never seen that particular expression, fear mingled with resolution, as if she was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing she had to jump. "What is it?" he asked, his voice weaker than he would have liked. The pain medication made his thoughts slightly fuzzy around the edges, but he could still see clearly that whatever Eleanor needed to say was costing her dearly. She drew a deep breath and opened the journal, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside were pages filled with handwriting that Harold recognized as hers, though the earlier entries seemed somehow different, less confident than her usual flowing script. "This is going to sound impossible," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I need you to listen all the way through." "Can you do that for me?" Harold nodded, suddenly afraid in a way that had nothing to do with his illness or approaching death. "My name isn't Eleanor Bennett," she said, the words falling into the quiet room like stones into still water. "My real name is Catherine Lowell." Harold blinked, certain he had misheard. "What are you talking about?" She clutched the journal tighter. "In 1967, I was a student at the Westbrook Academy of Art in New York. I was poor, a scholarship student surrounded by kids from wealthy families. My roommate was a girl named Eleanor Bennett." Harold's mind raced to catch up with what he was hearing. "Eleanor? But that's you." "You're Eleanor," she shook her head slowly. "No, Harold. I've been living as Eleanor for 55 years, but that's not who I was born as. I don't understand." Harold struggled to sit up straighter, and she quickly moved to help him, adjusting his pillows before continuing. "The real Eleanor was everything I wasn't. Confident, talented, from a good family with money. We weren't close friends, but we got along well enough as roommates. Then one night in April 1967, she had an aneurysm. It happened so suddenly. One minute she was getting ready for bed, the next, Catherine's voice broke. She collapsed. By the time the ambulance came, she was gone." Harold stared at his wife, this woman he thought he knew better than anyone in the world. "Go on," he said quietly. "I was in shock and scared. My scholarship was being revoked because of budget cuts. I had nowhere to go, no money, no family to help me. And there was Eleanor's acceptance letter to the Vermont Summer Art Program, fully paid with a stipend. It was right there on her desk." She swallowed hard. "I know it sounds terrible, but in that moment it seemed like the only way out. I wrote to the school as Eleanor, explaining I'd be arriving late due to a family emergency. I packed her things, her ID, her artwork, everything, and I left. I became Eleanor Bennett." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of decades of deception. Harold's mind whirled with questions, memories shifting and reforming under this new light. "Those trips you took every year," he said slowly. "Were you visiting her grave?" Catherine nodded, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "And sending money to her parents anonymously until they passed away in the 80s. I couldn't face them, but I couldn't just. They lost their daughter and I stole her future. And your birthday, the way you always withdrew around that time. It wasn't my birthday. It was hers, and the anniversary of when she died. Catherine wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. I always thought I would tell you, especially in the beginning. I planned to finish the summer program, save some money, and then come clean. But then I met you, and everything changed. Harold looked at the woman before him. The woman he had loved for more than 5 decades. The woman he thought he knew completely. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve the truth before... She couldn't finish the sentence. And because I've carried this secret for so long, Harold. It's eaten away at me year after year. The guilt, the fear of being discovered. Every time someone mistook one of my paintings for someone else's work, I wondered if they somehow sensed I was a fraud. Every time you looked at me with such love and trust, I hated myself a little for not being worthy of it. Harold was quiet for a long time, processing what he'd heard. The pain in his abdomen seemed distant compared to the ache in his heart. Did you ever love me at all? He finally asked, the question that mattered most. Catherine's face crumpled. How can you ask that? Of course I loved you. I love you more than anything in this world. That was never a lie, not for a single day. But everything else was. Our whole life together was built on a lie. Not everything, she said desperately. Not the life we built, not our home, not the way I feel about you. I may not have been born Eleanor Bennett, but I've lived as her for far longer than I ever lived as Catherine Lowell. In every way that matters, I became her. Harold turned his face away, looking out the window at the garden he had created, now showing the first hints of spring. The daffodils were just beginning to push through the soil. They would bloom after he was gone. Harold, please say something, Catherine pleaded, reaching for his hand. He didn't pull away, but he didn't grasp her hand either. I need time to think. Of course, she whispered, rising to leave. No, Harold said.
Stay, just...
Give me a moment. Catherine sat back down, the journal still clutched in her hands. Harold closed his eyes, memories flooding through his mind. Their first meeting by the lake, their wedding day, countless moments big and small spread across 55 years. He remembered the way Eleanor, Catherine, had looked at him that very first day, a mixture of interest and something he couldn't quite name. Had it been fear? The worry that he might somehow see through her deception? But he hadn't. For more than half a century he had loved her completely, never doubting who she was. When he opened his eyes again, Catherine was watching him. Her expression so vulnerable it made his heart twist despite everything. Did you think I wouldn't have loved you if I had known? He asked quietly. If you had been Catherine from the beginning? She wiped away fresh tears. I don't know. Maybe you would have. But I was so scared and so ashamed of what I'd done. The longer it went on, the harder it became to tell the truth. And then 1 year became 5. And 5 became 10. And suddenly we had this whole life together. And I couldn't bear the thought of losing it, of losing you. Harold considered this. At 83, facing the end of his life, what truly mattered? The name his wife had been born with, or the decades they had spent loving each other? Show me a picture of her, he said. The real Eleanor. Catherine hesitated, then carefully opened the journal to the back, where a small black and white photograph was tucked into a pocket. She handed it to Harold. The face that looked back at him was young and pretty, with a confident smile and eyes that seemed to look directly at the camera. There was a vague resemblance to the young woman he had met by the lake, but they were clearly not the same person. I always made sure to change enough details when I talked about my past, Catherine explained. I used parts of her life and parts of mine. After a while, it became hard to remember which was which. Harold handed the photograph back, feeling oddly calm now. What do you want me to say? I don't know, Catherine admitted. I just couldn't let you go without knowing the truth. You deserved that much from me. Harold reached for her hand then, finally taking it in his. Her skin was soft and familiar, mapped with the same age spots and veins as his own. These were the hands that had held his for a lifetime, regardless of what name they belonged to. I've known you as Eleanor for 55 years, he said softly. That's who you are to me. A sob escaped her. Can you forgive me? Harold thought about it honestly. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I know that I love you. That hasn't changed. He patted the edge of the bed and Catherine carefully sat beside him, mindful of the tubes and monitors. Harold put his arm around her shoulders, feeling how thin she had become with the stress of his illness and her secret. We don't have much time left, he said, the words simple, but heavy with meaning. I don't want to spend it in anger or regret. Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder, her tears soaking into his pajama shirt. I've been Catherine in my private thoughts all these years. It feels strange to hear you say it out loud. Would you prefer I call you that now? She considered it, then shook her head. No. I think after all this time, I really am Eleanor more than I am Catherine. If that makes any sense, Harold nodded. It does, actually. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. We all become different people as we live. Some just take a more dramatic route to get there. They sat together as the afternoon light faded into evening, talking softly about the past, both the shared past they had always discussed and the hidden past Catherine had kept to herself for so long. There were more tears, more questions, more moments of painful honesty, but through it all, their hands remained clasped together. 2 days later, Harold Mason died peacefully in his sleep, his wife of 55 years holding his hand. Whether he thought of her as Eleanor or Catherine in his final moments, only Harold knew. But his face was serene, and there was the ghost of a smile on his lips, as if he had made his peace with the astonishing truth and found it didn't change what mattered most.